So, despite Elizabeth's best efforts, it was hard, albeit impossible, to actually remove the idea of the religious clashes going on from her foreign policy. And something that Elizabeth was really passionate about, and Cecil realised this and was well aware of this, is she believed that a legitimate monarch should not be challenged. Essentially, even if she disagreed with the position that a particular monarch was taking, she was not fond of the idea of actually supporting a rebellion against them. For obvious reasons, because Elizabeth, in her position, could possibly be a victim of just that exact situation. Now, when it came to France, we had the issue of, with the changes going on in France, we get the death of Francis, and too young. So in one way, the death of Francis is helpful because it means that Mary Queen of Scots doesn't have the prominence that she was going to have in terms of having the possession of being the Queen of France and Scotland. And she leaves France and goes to Scottish court. But crucially, you now have a situation where Catherine de Medici, who was the mother of the king, her 10-year-old son, Charles IX, becomes king, but ultimately Catherine de Medici, as the regent, is running things. And she is very keen in focusing on the importance of persecuting the Protestants and promoting the importance of the Catholics. Now, you end up with some horrendous actions, really, including the massacre of the Huguenots. Now, France and Spain actually get closer through this period, but ultimately it's more the likelihood that Philip of Spain is looking to exploit the divisions within France. And obviously, as a Catholic, he's looking to form support there. But of course, from England's point of view, there is a concern that, well, hang on, it looks like we're seeing potential Catholic alliance which could be turned against England. But again, as I've said, the Queen is hesitant to end up becoming a kind of a Protestant agent, actor on the European stage in defence of the Protestants, because she's obviously is concerned that how that might lead to the reverse, a Catholic alliance against her. But she does decide to get involved in France, egged on by her council, certainly, and with the success of Scotland, it seems like a good opportunity, ideally, to get Calais back. And the idea being that the Huguenots will pass Calais over back to England in exchange for the assistance of England. So in September 1562, we get the Treaty of Hampton Court. And essentially, this is Elizabeth promising loans and military aid to the Huguenots, and English troops under Dudley's brother, the Earl of Warwick, and they go off to actually take part in military action in France. Unfortunately, the Huguenots viewed England's interventions primarily about supporting them on religious grounds, and they therefore are very unhappy and feel cheated when, having taken control of Le Havre, you then get the English looking to essentially swap it in exchange for Calais. Le Havre does surrender in June 1563, but the Huguenots, before we even get there, actually join forces with the Catholics to try and kick the English out of France, which really has not, it shows, or in Elizabeth's mind, it shows that she is on a hiding to nothing if she goes and supports rebels against a legitimate monarch. So in 1564, we get the Peace of Troy, which ends armed hostilities with France, and certainly does nothing to encourage Elizabeth into taking on more and more foreign adventures as the idea of having a Protestant foreign policy. It just isn't in her interests. Now, in terms of Elizabeth's policy towards France from 1564 up to 1583, we have two linked elements. The main element, of course, is Spain. Now, there's a deterioration in relations, which we'll come on to, between England and Spain. So although there is a traditional position, as think back to Mary's position on this, of England's hostility towards France, she recognises that actually she might need the French as potential allies against Philip. So there was a softening in the stance towards France, and there's also the concern that if the Guise in France end up becoming more and more prominent, and they may, well, certainly they're the more likely faction, given their aggressive Catholicism, to start working with Spain. And this particularly concerns Cecil. Now, it isn't, having said that there's these two ideas, it really isn't the case that English foreign policy is some kind of clever designed way of counter-attacking or prevention of this. English foreign policy at this time is fairly muddled, I think it's fair to say, even to the point where when there is a suspension of trade between England and Spain in 1569, we actually get Elizabeth looking to enter into marriage negotiations with the Duke of Anjou, Henry. Now, he was the second son of Catherine de' Medici, and given what I've just said about the relationship between Catherine de' Medici, it's a bit unusual. However, Catherine de' Medici is the bitter enemy of the Guise faction. And the Guise faction are the aggressive Catholics who Elizabeth is keen to prevent holding sway in France. So although Elizabeth got absolutely no intention of marrying Anjou, she's happy to use these discussions as an opportunity to further sort of ingratiate herself with Catherine de' Medici and that faction in France. So any previous bad feeling is gone. And there's an attempt to try and build on this. We get a treaty in 1572 called the Treaty of Blois. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation, Blois, in 1572. And that really is a product. And what is particularly useful of this, and while this is a prized treaty from Elizabeth's point of view, is under the terms of the treaty, France rejects and abandons its recognition of Mary Stuart as the rightful Queen of England. So we get actually a sort of what is in effect a defensive league between England and Spain, England and France, sorry, clearly directed against Spain. Now, on the 24th of August, 1572, we get an almighty spanner thrown into the mix, the massacre of the Huguenots on St. Bartholomew's Day. Now, without going too much into the ins and outs of this, essentially, Catherine is concerned that the Protestant leader, Coligny, are coming too close to Charles IX, her son, and she's worried about the potential of Protestants or Huguenots gaining prominence. So there ends up being at least 3,000 Huguenots are murdered in the city, Coligny being the first of them. Now, there is outrage about this, and there is obviously a concern that if Mary, Queen of Scots, were to be put on the throne by France and England, what could happen to the Protestants? And the Queen does have militant Protestants on her council. Now, they are urging her to send the army to defend the Huguenots on the basis of not only defending the religion of Protestantism, but also in self-preservation, because they are arguing that, this could be a preamble for a move into England, an attack on England. However, Elizabeth is not having any of it, because remember, as I said earlier, Elizabeth is dead against the idea of supporting rebels against a legitimate monarch. And she has developed a pretty good, I hesitate to call it a friendship, but more mutually beneficial relationship with Catherine de' Medici. So what England actually does, and Elizabeth, I think, is pretty clever with this, is she negotiates with both sides. So unofficially helps offer to the Huguenots, but at the same time talks are renewed with Catherine de' Medici on the idea of a marriage of England, of Elizabeth to and Anjou. So it's clever, and some historians have argued that it actually is Elizabeth who, in this action, prevents and is the buffer to what could potentially have been an absolutely hazardous foreign adventure of England in defence of Protestantism, which would have drawn France and Spain closer together and could ultimately have led to a religious war on the continent, which England definitely did not want. Okay. Now, in terms of this idea of the Anjou marriage, now that we end up, he ultimately becomes Alençon as he gets older and moves into a different position. But the main focus of these negotiations is actually what's happening in the Netherlands. There has been a lot of Spanish success against rebels in the Netherlands, and it looked like Anjou was going to play a significant part. Although he is a Catholic, he's fiercely anti-Spanish, which again shows this idea that actually, for all the framing of this period as being a period of religious division, still there are predominantly nationalistic, patriotic lines drawn across Europe, which are dominating the actions that are taken. Now, obviously, the concern here is that there could be a replacement of the Spanish influence in the Netherlands with French influence of the Netherlands through Anjou, and they don't want a straight replacement of Spanish authority with French authority. So what Elizabeth looks to do as Anjou starts to set himself up for this is, considering there's this idea of a marriage in the background, is Elizabeth looks to actually get involved in what's happening in the Netherlands by offering a commitment for finance and troops to actually support the rebels in the Netherlands, which does seem to be a departure from what we have seen from Elizabeth before. Now, in terms of Elizabeth's relationship with Anjou, now historians do really disagree over this. There are prominent historians who actually argue and say that Elizabeth did want to marry the Duke of Anjou, but her council were against it and persuaded her out of it because, we're talking about Mary Part 2 here, the idea of the French influence, a French Catholic, even worse, having influence over English policy. But there is also historians who say that Elizabeth had no intention of this. What is true is that it could have been beneficial for England had Elizabeth married Anjou. Certainly the idea of how it could have had an opportunity for her to have a greater influence on what happened in the Netherlands, which is so economically important for England, quite apart from the possible religious ramifications. But it doesn't happen, and actually when Elizabeth does offer some support for Anjou's campaign in the Netherlands, that backfires anyway, and he's back in France by 1583. So it really is not an episode which has any great deal of change, other than to show that the Netherlands was extremely important to Elizabeth. It shows that still, when you look across this, looking for a relationship, alliance with a Catholic, still things are running along nation-state lines rather than religious lines. And in effect, Elizabeth is still using the prospect or the potential for her as a candidate for marriage to try and shape advantages for England in their foreign policy. She's certainly treading a fine line with it, but nonetheless it is part of what she's trying to do. Now, relations with France become treacherous potentially in 1584 when Anjou dies, and there is the prospect again of a battle between the Huguenots and the Guises in terms of who is going to be leading France. And we get what's known as the French Catholic League. Now, the French Catholic League, they were founded in 1576 by Duke Henri of Guise with the aim of destroying Protestantism in France and preventing a Protestant, Henry of Navarre, from succeeding to the French throne. Now, this is really problematic for Elizabeth because this suggests, particularly when Philip II is in favour of the Catholic League, this suggests that we could have Spain and France working together as a prelude to a joint French and Spanish invasion of England. Again, if this becomes a sort of Catholic crusade. Now, Henry Navarre does rise to the throne, becomes Henry IV of France, but France is divided between the Catholics and the Protestants and the Huguenots. Spanish troops are sent and to France. They are in Brittany, they overrun Normandy, and there is real concern in England that we're going to see, in effect, this come to path of a Catholic sort of extreme Catholic alliance of France and Spain directed against England. Now, Elizabeth does offer, in the interest of England, certainly not in the interest of international Protestantism, she does offer armed support for Henri of Navarre. What's curious is in 1593, Henry, I'll stop trying to sound posh, Henry IV actually converts to Catholicism. And as part of this, he also offers toleration to the Huguenots. So this religious civil war, in effect, is ended. And that's good news because it makes the Catholic League irrelevant and it removes this cause, this unifying factor of potentially bringing France and Spain together. Now, because of Henry's actions, we now effectively have a united France. Only when the Francis War with Spain starts to cause problems in 1596 that we see English troops sent back in to support the French potentially. But this is not a position that England wants to be in. So in 1596, we actually get a triple alliance concluded between the Dutch, the French, and the English. And as part of this, Elizabeth actually recognises the United Provinces as a sovereign state. Now, it's quite interesting how long this took, but that fits in with the idea that Elizabeth has been so keen for so long not to recognise the rights of rebels over legitimate rulers that she was very reluctant to act in a way that could potentially help England in this case, although she wouldn't see it that way. And in 1598, we get a peace between France and Spain, and things kind of settle down. Now, looking at Elizabeth's relations with France overall, definitely during this period we see a move away from the traditional idea of France as a natural enemy, and Spain becomes a greater threat. The Netherlands continues to be a key factor and arguably the most important factor in English foreign policy, particularly the threat of Spanish dominance over the Netherlands, but equally they don't want the French having control there either. Now, foreign policy is a bit messy because of the religious aspect. Elizabeth, as we know, is not a fully brought up radical Protestant at all, and certainly isn't driven by religion when it comes to what her instinct is in foreign policy. So she is really almost constantly fighting against or guarding against the influence of the Protestants in her council, to the point where she is arguably seen as indecisive. Now, whether this is Elizabeth playing it clever, as some would say is part of a character to be non-committal, but this indecisiveness does mean that it creates opportunities for others to perhaps cause problems and for situations to arise like that in terms of the clashes between the Navarre and the Guise faction in France. If Elizabeth had been more decisive, then things like the French Catholic League and the impact, the potential threat of Spain joining in with that may not have been as much of an issue. So I think I would say, past interpretation, is it's fair to say that in terms of the relations with France, Elizabeth's quite lucky at what happens with Henry IV converting to Catholicism and things settling down, basically.